On a summer morning in 2014, on a small island in the middle of New York Harbor, two educators announced they were going to put 1 billion oysters back into the water beneath them. The harbor around them had been officially declared lifeless for most of a century. The island was Governor's Island. The educators were Pete Malinowski, an aquaculture teacher who had grown up on his family's oyster farm on Fisher's Island, and Murray Fisher, a naturalist who had founded a maritime public high school 11 years earlier in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Almost no marine scientist believed a self-sustaining oyster reef could ever return to this water. There had been no legal oyster harvest since 1927. The harbor floor had been dredged for a century, scraped clean of the shell reefs that once covered it. The combined sewer system, running since 1849, still dumped raw sewage into the harbor every time it rained. The two men decided they were going to put 1 billion oysters back anyway. They named the project the Billion Oyster Project. The word "back" is doing a lot of work in that sentence. To understand why, you need the number that almost no one in New York today believes. When Henry Hudson sailed into this harbor in 1609, there were roughly 220,000 acres of oyster reef beneath his ship. That is a larger area than the entire modern city of New York. Some of the oysters were nearly a foot long. Scholars estimate this single estuary held close to half of every oyster on the planet. New York was not a city with a lot of oysters. New York was where the world's oysters were. 3 centuries later, there were essentially none. The reefs had been dredged out. The oysters had been eaten by the tens of millions each week. And what the harvest did not kill, the sewage did. In 1927, after a typhoid outbreak, the last commercial oyster bed in the city was closed. The Billion Oyster Project's stated goal is to put 1 billion oysters back into the harbor by 2035. As of the end of 2025, they were past 150 million. Almost every scientist who studied this harbor said it could not be done. Subscribe and watch them all be proven wrong. So, how did the richest oyster ground in the world end up empty? 6,900 years ago, the Lenape were already eating oysters here. Archaeologists have found shell middens along the shoreline that date back that far. Some of the middens grew so tall over the centuries that they became landmarks. The Dutch mistook one, at what is now the corner of Canal Street and the Bowery, for a small hill. They named it Calch Hook, Shell Point. Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan got its name from another one. When Hudson arrived, the harbor was one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. Whales worked the outer waters, dolphins, seals, seahorses in the shallows, herring and striped bass ran the tides. And beneath all of it, holding the whole system in place, roughly 220,000 acres of oyster reef. For most of the next 2 centuries, oysters were the food of New York. Rich and poor ate them equally. Street carts sold them for a penny apiece. At Downing's Oyster House on Broad and Wall, opened by a free black man named Thomas Downing in 1825, the city's bankers ate them by the dozen. At the oyster cellars along the Bowery, there was a promotion known as the Canal Street Plan. 6 cents. All the oysters you could eat. You cannot serve half the world's oysters to a hungry city for 200 years and expect the reef to stay. By 1849, the city began building a combined sewer system that still runs today. Every time it rains hard, raw sewage and stormwater pour into the harbor together. By 1906, the harbor was described as nearly lifeless. When the Grand Central Oyster Bar opened underneath the terminal in 1913, it already had to source its oysters from Long Island. There were essentially none left in New York to serve. The final closure came in 1927, after typhoid was traced to a Staten Island bed. But the deeper problem was not the water. Even when the Clean Water Act arrived in 1972, and the harbor slowly recovered, the oysters did not return. The trap was not chemistry. The trap was geometry. A baby oyster is called a spat. To become an adult, it has to land on a hard surface made of calcium carbonate and cement itself down within its first day of life. That surface is almost always another oyster's shell. When the reefs of New York Harbor were dredged and eaten, the shell went with them. Once the shell is gone, larvae drift, sink into the mud, and die. Without shell, no new oysters. Without new oysters, no new shell. The reef cannot rebuild itself, even in clean water. Every summer for 80 years, oyster larvae drifted through this harbor with nowhere to land. The two men who decided to change that are, in almost every important way, opposites. Pete Malinowski grew up as one of 6 children on a working oyster farm on Fisher's Island, at the eastern end of Long Island Sound. He can tell you what an oyster is doing in the water by looking at the shell. He came to New York City in 2008 to teach aquaculture at a public high school that had opened 5 years earlier in Bushwick, called the Urban Assembly New York Harbor School. Murray Fisher, the man who hired him, is the founder of that school. He is a social entrepreneur and naturalist with no aquaculture background at all. What he had was a stubborn belief that most conservation projects in cities die because the people who live around them are never really part of them. Their founding line for the whole project reads like a warning. Restoration without education is temporary. So they inverted the standard order. Almost every marine restoration project in the world begins with scientists and finishes, if it finishes, with public outreach. Fisher and Malinowski began with a public high school. Kids first, Reef second. In 2010, the Harbor School moved from Bushwick to Governor's Island, a former Coast Guard base sitting 800 yards south of Manhattan. Malinowski was already teaching students how to breed oyster larvae in a hatchery converted from an old military building. In 2014, they took the operation out of the classroom and turned it into a city-wide project. They gave themselves 21 years to restore 1 billion oysters. They still have 9. The strange part is what they did next. They did not start by breeding more oysters. They started by collecting shells, because they had understood the trap. If the harbor could not rebuild itself without shell, then the missing input was not larvae. It was the surface the larvae would land on. New York City eats, by their own reporting, up to 500,000 oysters every week. Almost all of those shells go into the garbage. The Billion Oyster Project began, in 2014, by convincing a small group of Manhattan restaurants to save them instead. Today, roughly 83 restaurants across the city keep separate bins in their kitchens. Every day, a Chelsea Market seafood distributor, called the Lobster Place, picks up the bins and trucks the shells to Governor's Island. Then the shells sit outside for a full year. Nothing happens to them. No one washes them. No one processes them. They are piled in the open salt air for 4 full seasons. Snow, rain, wind, sun, until any pathogen from a restaurant plate has been killed by simple exposure. Roughly 300,000 pounds of shell a year, curing outdoors, at the pace of weather. Only then are the shells ready to go back. Meanwhile, in the hatchery, Harbor School students produce spat. Millions of them. The larvae are settled onto the cured shells inside tanks, where they cement themselves down within hours. Each old restaurant shell now carries dozens of tiny living oysters. Bagged into mesh sacks, they are boated out to 17 restoration sites across the harbor. Governor's Island, Bush Terminal in Brooklyn, the Bronx River at Soundview, the head of Jamaica Bay, the Tottenville shore off Staten Island. There, they are lowered into the water and left. The chain that this sets in motion said in 5 sentences, is the whole logic of the project. Shell means substrate. Substrate means spat can settle. Settled spat means oysters. Oysters mean shell. And once there is enough new shell in the water, the reef begins to rebuild itself. It is not fast. A young oyster needs about 3 years to reach reproductive size. A working reef, one that thickens and self-seeds, takes at least a decade. In practice, the project is doing something that sounds absurd when you say it out loud. A plate of oysters eaten at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Tribeca last summer becomes, 1 year later, the childhood home of another oyster. The eater becomes the eaten's roof. None of it works without the year of curing outdoors. That is the receipt. The results, as of late 2025, are difficult to argue with. More than 150 million oysters restored across 17 active sites. Roughly 17 acres of reef. Nearly 3 million pounds of shell recycled from restaurant kitchens. Oysters in the harbour are now naturally reproducing, which means the population has begun to seed itself. The wider harbour has answered too. Whales returned to New York waters in 2010 for the first time in about a century. Seahorses, blue lobsters, pipefish, pufferfish, and red-beard sponge have been recorded at restored reef sites. New York City reports its combined sewer overflows are down about 85% since the 1990s. In October 2025, the state finalized water body reclassifications aiming, for the first time in generations, at swimmable and fishable. But an honest accounting has to include the caveats. The famous statistic that one oyster filters 50 gallons of water a day, cited by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and by New York State, is a laboratory maximum. Matthew Gray, a scientist at the University of Maryland's Horn Point Laboratory, told the Bay Journal in 2020 that this is about the near maximum rate at which the eastern oyster will filter under laboratory conditions at optimum temperatures and very high-quality diets. In real conditions, in a real harbour, a wild oyster more likely filters 3 to 12 gallons a day. Meaningful, not miraculous. And here is the caveat almost nobody expects. These oysters are not safe to eat. The Billion Oyster Project's own frequently asked questions page says it plainly. Because of combined sewer overflow and legacy heavy metals in the harbour sediment, the oysters in these reefs are harmful to digest. They are cleaning the water. They are not becoming food. Restoration and consumption, for now, are two different projects, and the project is explicit that theirs is only the first. There is also a scale gap. 150 million oysters is impressive. It is not 1 billion. To reach the goal by 2035, the project has to install roughly 100 million oysters a year, well above its current pace. And even the reefs already in the water face genuine threats. Predators called oyster drills work through settled beds. Hypoxia, low dissolved oxygen, kills spat. Dermo disease has been recorded in the harbour. Some residents in Tottenville, where the $111 million Living Breakwaters project was completed in September 2024, remain skeptical about whether it will do what its designers promise. The billion is not guaranteed. It is an argument being made in shell. The clearest evidence is not in any study. It is in the shells themselves. Somewhere on the harbour floor tonight, a shell that came off a plate in Manhattan last summer, that sat through a winter in the open air on Governor's Island, is holding a living oyster in place. That oyster is filtering 3 to 12 gallons of harbour water a day. It is producing more shell. On that new shell, sometime in the next few years, another spat will settle. The eater becomes the eaten's roof. The reef becomes the water it cleans. New York ate its harbour. Then, slowly, one restaurant bin at a time, it began giving it back. The harbour was not restored. It was given back the thing that used to restore it, If the mechanics of reversing centuries of coastal damage interest you, subscribe.